The story you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts featuring historical characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Albert DeSalvo is best known for confessing to be the Boston Strangler who killed 13 women in Boston in the early 1960s. Although it has long been considered that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, there has been some controversy in recent years that he may not have been responsible for all 13 murders. All of the victims were female, elderly, and alone, and had resided in the Boston area. These murders were often referred to as the silk stocking murders because each of the victims appeared to have been strangled with a silk stocking. Even though there is doubt about Albert DeSalvo's role in these murders, they are still attributed to him as the killer. Albert Henry DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and was one of the 5 children born into a household of alcoholism and violence. His father was a wife-beating alcoholic. He began getting into trouble at a young age, largely for petty crimes and minor violence. During his young years, DeSalvo would knock on women's doors claiming to be scouting for new models, and he managed to convince many of them to let him into their homes. Once inside, he would proceed to measure them up under the pretense of checking if they would be suitable as models. This led to him being charged with sexually oriented mischievousness, and he was sent to prison for 18 months. He spent some time in the army but was eventually discharged for not obeying orders. Following his discharge, he married German woman Irmgard Beck. Their first child was born handicapped, but despite their modest income and the added expense of the child, they managed to sustain themselves. According to his wife, DeSalvo was highly sexed, but she would try and avoid having sex with him out of fear of having another baby that was handicapped. However, she couldn't avoid him forever, and she subsequently gave birth to a healthy baby boy. DeSalvo had settled into the role of a family man and was well liked by his employer and his work colleagues, even though he was an outrageous braggart, which perhaps led the police to later disbelieve his claims to be the Strangler. Between June 1962 and January 1964, a series of grisly murders took place in Boston. All the victims were women who had been strangled. The Boston slayings were blamed on one lone sociopath, and mystery still surrounds the case. The first known victim of the Strangler was Anna Slessors, 55 years old. She was found dead by her son Juris in her apartment in Back Bay, Boston, on June 14, 1962. An object had been used to sexually assault her, and she had been strangled to death with a belt from her bathrobe tied around her neck in a bow. Just under 3 weeks later, on June 28, 1962, 85-year-old Mary Mullen was also found murdered in her home. 2 days later, the body of 68-year-old Nina Nichols was also discovered in the Brighton area of Boston. It appeared to be a burglary despite valuable silver that appeared untouched. The ransacking didn't seem to make sense to detectives. Nichols was also found in a state of undress, her legs wide open and her stocking tops tied in a bow. The next victim of the Strangler was Helen Blake, 65, on the same night, and her murder was more gruesome. She had suffered lacerations to her vagina and anus. Again, the bow trademark was evident, this time made from tying her bra around her neck. Like the previous crimes, the scene appeared to be a burglary. Police profiling had already decided that in all probability, they were looking for a psychopath whose hatred of older women may actually be linked to his own relationship with his mother. Ida Irga, 75 years old, was killed on August 19. She had been strangled and she was on her back on the floor, wearing a brown nightdress which was ripped and exposed her body. Her legs were apart and resting on 2 chairs, and a cushion had been placed under her buttocks. Again, there was no sign of forced entry. On August 21 in Dorchester, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was sexually assaulted and strangled to death with her stockings. There were no further known murders until the killing of Sophie Clark, 20 years old, on December 5, 1962. She had been strangled by her own stockings and semen was discovered for the first time. 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was pregnant when she was found dead in her apartment near the area where Slessors and Clark had lived. Bissett was discovered by her boss when she didn't turn up for work. Her body lay in her bed covered by sheets and she had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own stockings. The murder of Mary Brown occurred on March 6, 1963 and was a lot more violent than the previous murders. Mary had been raped, beaten, strangled, and stabbed in her own apartment in Massachusetts. The next woman murdered was Beverly Siemens, 23 years old. She was found with her hands tied behind her back with one of her scarves. A nylon stocking and 2 handkerchiefs were tied around her neck. Bizarrely, a piece of cloth over her mouth hid a second cloth which had been stuffed in her mouth. 4 stab wounds to her neck had most likely killed her rather than strangulation on May 6, 1963. There were also 22 stab wounds to Siemens' body, 18 of which were in the shape of a bullseye on her right breast. She had been raped, but there was no evidence of semen. It was thought that because of her strong throat muscles due to singing, the killer had to take to stabbing her instead of strangulation. The police, who were now desperate, even sought the help of a clairvoyant. He described the killer as a mental patient who escaped from Boston State Hospital on the days the killings took place. However, this was soon discounted when another murder was committed. On September 8, Evelyn Corbin, 58 years old, was raped and strangled with her nylon stockings and found in her home in Salem, Massachusetts. Corbin was found nude and on her bed face up. Her underwear had been stuffed in her mouth, and again, there were traces of semen, both on lipstick stains and in her mouth. Corbin's apartment had been ransacked in a similar fashion. On January 25, 1963, the body of Joanne Graff, 23 years old, was found in her apartment after being strangled with her stockings. Several descriptions of her attacker matched those of the man who had asked to paint Clark's neighbor's flat. The description detailed a man wearing dark green slacks, dark shirt, and jacket. There was a brief break following this murder, with the next occurring on January 4, 1964. Mary Sullivan, 19 years old, was found dead sitting on her bed, her back against the headboard. She had been strangled with a dark stocking. She had been sexually assaulted with a broom handle. This obscenity was rendered even more disturbing by the fact that a Happy New Year card lay wedged between her feet. This was the last known murder committed by the Boston Strangler. After spending time in prison for breaking and entering, DeSalvo went on to commit more serious crimes. He had broken into a woman's apartment, tied her up on the bed, and held a knife to her throat before molesting her and running away. The victim gave the police a good description, one that matched his likeness sketch from his previous crimes. Shortly afterward, DeSalvo was arrested. It was after he had been picked out of an identity parade that DeSalvo admitted to robbing hundreds of apartments and carrying out a couple of rapes. He then confessed to being the Boston Strangler to George Nassar, a fellow inmate. The two apparently had worked out a deal to split the reward money that would go to anyone who supplied information to the identity of the Strangler. DeSalvo had accepted that he would be in prison for the rest of his life and wanted his family to be financially secure. Nassar reported DeSalvo's claims to his attorney, who then informed the police. When DeSalvo was interviewed by the police, he gave a lot of information that wasn't public knowledge. However, not all of his claims matched the crime scenes of some of the murders. There was also no physical evidence that he was responsible for the murders. DeSalvo went on trial for a number of sexual offenses he had committed previously. During the period he was referred to as the Green Man and the Measuring Man, where he raped and assaulted women but did not kill them. Found guilty of the sexual assaults, DeSalvo was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1967, but was never charged with the murders. The same year he was sentenced, he escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital where he was being held with two other inmates. He turned himself into the authorities the next day and was sent to the Walpole State Prison, which was a maximum security facility. On November 27, 1973, DeSalvo was found murdered in the prison infirmary, having suffered stab wounds. Inmate Robert Wilson, who was associated with the Winter Hill Gang, was charged with the murder, but because of a hung jury, he was never convicted. For many years, there was some speculation as to whether or not DeSalvo was in fact the Boston Strangler. The murder that triggered most of the controversy was that of Mary Sullivan. During his confession, DeSalvo claimed to have penetrated Sullivan sexually, yet the autopsy showed no evidence that any sexual activity had taken place. In 2001, DeSalvo's body was exhumed and DNA tests were taken and compared to evidence taken from the last Strangler victim, Mary Sullivan. There was no match. Though this only proved that DeSalvo had not sexually assaulted Sullivan, it did not rule out his involvement in her murder. In July 2013, it was announced that DeSalvo's body would be exhumed yet again for re-evaluation using new forensic testing, with reports speculating that this new analysis could finally provide concrete proof of the Boston Strangler's identity. The family of DeSalvo and a nephew of Mary Sullivan continued to believe in DeSalvo's innocence of the 13 murders to which he confessed. They remain convinced that the killer is still alive. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twisted Mind and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat!